וקיים מודה אני לפניך רוח חי וקיים ילילה שחזרת בי נשמתי בחמלה רבה אמונתך שחזרת בי נשמתי בחמלה רבה אמונתך מודה אני לפניך רוח חי וקיים מודה אני לפניך רוח חי וקיים ילילה שחזרת בי נשמתי בחמלה רבה אמונתך שחזרת בי נשמתי בחמלה רבה אמונתך.
Boker Tov, Shabbat Shalom. Welcome to everybody joining us today in person, on Zoom, on Facebook, and YouTube. We continue our Shacharit Shel Shabbat services on page 192 with Matovu, reflecting and being thankful on the warmth of such a beautiful community. Matovu alecha Yaakov, Mishkanotecha Yisrael, ve'ani barov chastecha avo beitecha shtachave Elohecha kadshecha biratecha. Adonai ahavti ma'on beitecha makon mishkan kevodecha. Va'ani eshtachave ve'echre v'recha lefnei Adonai osi. Va'ani tefilati lecha Adonai et ratzon. Elohim barov chastecha aneni bi'emet yishacha. We turn to page 194. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Asher yatzar et ha'adam bechachma uvrei nekavim nekavim chalulim chalulihim. Galui v'yadua lefnei kisei kvodecha she'im yaftach echad mehem o yistam echad mehem i efshar liyitkayem ulamo lefanecha. Baruch atah Adonai rofei kol basar u'mafli la'asohot.
Amen.
We are on page 196 for Elohai Neshama.
Elohai neshama shenatata bi tehorai Elohai neshama shenatata bi tehorai ata birata ata yetzarta ata nefachta bi ve'ata meshamra b'kirbi ve'ata atid litla mimeni ולחזירה בי לתדאבו כל זמן שנשמה בקרבי מודה אני לפניך כל זמן שנשמה בקרבי מודה אני לפניך אדוני אלוהי ואלוהי אבותיי אדוני אלוהי ואלוהי אמותיי ריבון כל המעשים אדון כל הנשמות ריבון כל המעשים source of all creation, sovereign of all souls, praised are you, Adonai, in whose hand is every living soul and the breath of humankind. Baruch atah Adonai, asher beyado nefesh kol chai, v'ruach kol basar ish.
Amen. We turn to 198 for the daily miracles.
Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, who has given the mind the ability to distinguish day from night.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, who opens the eyes of the blind.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, who frees the captive.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, who lifts up the fallen.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, who stretches the earth over the waters.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, who strengthens our steps.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, who clothes the naked.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, who gives strength to the weary.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, who removes sleep from the eyes, slumber from the eyelids.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, who has made me in the image of God.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, who has given me free will.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, who has made me a Jew.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, who girds Israel with strength.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, who crowns Israel with splendor.
Amen.
Focusing our attention on the daily imperative to continuously learn about ourselves, our community, and the world around us, we turn to page 204 for the blessing for the daily study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. O Adonai our God, let the words of Torah be sweet in our mouths and the mouths of your people Israel, so that we, our descendants, and the descendants of all your people Israel, may know you by studying your Torah for its own sake. Baruch atah Adonai, hamelamed Torah li'amo Yisrael.
Amen. We continue on the bottom of page 206. These are things that are limitless, of which a person enjoys the fruit of the world while the principle remains in the world to come. They are honoring one's parents, engaging in deeds of compassion, arriving early for study morning and evening, dealing graciously with guests, visiting the sick, providing for the wedding couple, accompanying the dead for burial, being devoted in prayer, and making peace among people. But the study of Torah encompasses them all.
We turn to page 212 for Baruch Shamar.
Baruch Shamar, v'haya haolam, Baruch Hu, Baruch Shemo, Baruch Aseh, Bereshit, Baruch Omer, Ve'oseh, Baruch Gozer, Umekayem, Baruch Merachem, Al Haaretz, Baruch Merachem, Al Abriot, Baruch Meshalem, Sachatov Lireav, Baruch Haila'ad, V'kayam Lanetzach, Baruch Podeh, Umatzil, Baruch Hu, Baruch Shemo, we extol you and proclaim your sovereignty, for you are the source of life in the universe. One God, life of the universe, praised and glorious ruler, your name is eternal. Melech mehulam, batishbachot, Melech mehulam, batishbachot, Baruch atah Adonai, Melech meholal, batishbachot.
Amen. We flip to 214 for Mizmor Shir.
Mizmor, Mizmor Shir, Shir leyom HaShabbat. 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 Mizmor Shir, Shir leyom HaShabbat. Mizmor Shir, Shir leyom HaShabbat. Mizmor, Mizmor Shir, Shir leyom HaShabbat. Mizmor, Mizmor Shir, Shir leyom HaShabbat. Mizmor Shir, Shir leyom HaShabbat. Mizmor Shir, Shir leyom HaShabbat. We continue with Ashrei on the top of page 215. אשרי העם שככה לו, אשרי העם שאדוני אלוהיו, אשרי העם שככה לו, אשרי העם שאדוני אלוהיו, אשרי יושבי ביתך הודיע הללוך צלה, אשרי יושבי ביתך הודיע הללוך צלה, אשרי העם שככה לו, אשרי העם שאדוני אלוהיו, אשרי העם שככה לו, אשרי העם שאדוני אלוהיו, אשרי העם שככה לו, אשרי העם שאדוני אלוהיו, אשרי העם שככה לו, אשרי העם שאדוני אלוהיו.
תהילה לבירה מיכל, החי המלך והמשך לעולם ועד.
בכל ימיו וחלקה, והללה שמך לעולם ועד.
גדול אדוני ומעולם מאוד, גלי תהילתו אין חקר.
דור לדור ישבח מעשיך, וגבורותיך יגידו.
הדר כבוד הודך, ודברי נפותיך עשיך.
ועזוז נורותיך יאמרו, וגדולתך אספרנה.
זכר רב טובך יביעו, וצדקך ירננו.
חנון ורחום אדוני, ערך אפיים וגדול חסד.
טוב אדוני לעכו, ורחמיו כל מעשיו.
יודוך אדוני כל מעשיך, וחסידיך יברכוך.
כבוד מלכותך יאמרו, וגבורתך ידברו.
להודיע לבני האדם גבורותיו, וכבוד הדר מלכותו.
מלכותך מלכות כל עולמים, ומשלתך בכל דור ודור.
סומך אדוני לכל הנופלים, וזוקף לכל הכפופים.
הנה כה אליך יסברו, ואתה נותן להם את החלם בעתו.
פותח את ידיך, ומשביע לכל חי רצון.
צדיק אדוני בכל דרכיו, וחסיד בכל מעשיו.
קרוב אדוני לכל קוראיו, לכל אשר יקראו באמת.
רצון יראיו יעשה, ואת שבתם ישמע ויושיעם.
שומר אדוני את כוכביו ואת כל רשעים ישמין.
תהילת אדוני ידבר פיו, ויברך כל בשר השם קדשו לעולם ועד.
ואנחנו נברך יה מעתה ועד עולם. הללויה.
We're on 218 for hallelujah.
Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. כל הנשמה תהלליה, הללויה, הללויה. כל הנשמה תהלליה, הללויה, 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 הללויה,
נשמת כל חי תברך את שמך אדוני אלוהינו, ורוח כל בשר תבער ותרמם זרחך מלכנו תמיד. We turn to 220 for Ilufinu.
אילופינו מלא שיר הקיים ולשוננו רינה וידינו פרוסות כנשרי שמיים ורגלינו קלות כילות. אילופינו מלא שיר הקיים ולשוננו רינה וידינו פרוסות כנשרי שמיים ורגלינו קלות כילות. אין אנחנו מספיקים להודות לך ולברך את שמך מלכנו. אין אנחנו מספיקים להודות לך ולברך את שמך מלך מלכי המלכים, מלך מלכי המלכים, מלך מלכי המלכים. ופינו מלא שיר הקיים ולשוננו רינה וידינו פרוסות כנשרי שמיים ורגלינו קלות כילות. ופינו מלא שיר הקיים ולשוננו רינה וידינו פרוסות כנשרי שמיים ורגלינו קלות כילות.
We're on the top of 222. Ha'el b'tatu motuzecha, ha'gadol b'kavod shemecha, ha'gibor la'netzach, v'hanora b'noratecha, ha'melech ha'yoshev al kisei ram v'nisaha.
שוכנת מרום וקדוש שמו וכתוב רננו צדיקים באדוני לישרים נבע תהילה בפי ישרים תתהלל ובדברי צדיקים תתברך ולשון חסידים תתרומם ובקרב קדושים תתקדש ומקלות יבוא עמך בית ישראל ורינה יתפאר שמך מלכנו בכל דור ודור ישתבח שמך לעד מלכנו האל המלך הגדול והקדוש בשמיים ובארץ. כי לך נאה אדוני אלוהינו ואלוהי אבותינו ואימותינו, שושבחה אליו בזמרה, עוז וממשלה, נצח גדולה גבורה, תהילה ותפארת, קדושה ומלכות, ברכות והוראות מעתה ועד עולם. ברוך אתה אדוני אל מלך גדול בתשבחות, אל ההודעות אדון הנפלאות, הבוחר בשירי זמרה, מלך מלכי העולמים. יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה, בעלמא דברה חירותי וימליך מלכותי, בחייכון וביומייכון ובחייתך בית ישראל. בעגלה ובזמן קריב ואמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מברך לעולם ולעלמי עלמיה. יתברך, יתברך וישתבח, ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא, ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל, שמי דקדושה בריחו לעילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה. תושבחתה ונחמתה תמירן בעלמא ואמרו אמן.
May rise for Baruch on 226.
ברכו את אדוני המבורך.
Be seated. We continue on page 228. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, yotzer or u'varecha she'choseh shalom u'varei hatakoho. Ha'me'ir la'aretz l'derei berachamim u'tuvo mechadesh b'cho yom tamid maseh bereshit marabu masacha Adonai kulam b'chachma asita mala aret kinyanecha titbarach Adonai Eloheinu al shafach maseh yadecha va'al me'arei or she'asita v'ruch hasala or Chadash al Tzion Tair v'niske kulana mehera le'arod Baruch atah Adonai Yotzer ha'me'orohot.
Amen.
We turn to page 230, and before we recite Ahava Rabbah, the passage of great love, as we do every week, we take a moment and focus on this idea of love, how we can tap into it, looking forward to the week ahead, how to increase love that we have for ourselves, for our family, for our community, for people in other communities. Ahava Rabbah on page 230. Ahava Rabbah aftanu Adonai Eloheinu chemla gedola ve'terach chemlata aleinu ba'avor avotenu v'imatenu Shabbat becha v'tamidem chukei chayim ken techanenu u'tamidenu hamerachem rachem aleinu v'ten b'leibenu lahavinu lahaskil lishmoa lilmod u'lelamed u'lashmor u'lasot u'lekayem et kol divrei tamud toratacha b'avaha.
Gather us in peace from the four corners of the earth, and lead us upright to our land. For you, O God, work wonders. You chose us. Truly, you drew us near to your great name, that we might acknowledge you, declaring you one in love. Praise be you, Adonai, who chooses your people Israel in love. Baruch atah Adonai, habocher be'amo Yisrael be'ahava. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. We continue on page 234. ואהבת את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודיך, והיו הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי מצווך היום על לבביך, ושיננתם לבניך ודיברת בם בשבתך בביתך ובלכתך בדרך ובשוכבך ובקומך, וקשרתם נרות על ידך והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך, וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך. We continue in the middle of page 236. Adonai said to Moses as follows, "Speak to the Israelite people and instruct them to make for themselves fringes on the corners of their garments throughout the ages. Let them attach a cord of blue to the fringe at each corner. That shall be your fringe. Look at it and recall all the commandments of Adonai and observe them, so you do not follow your heart and eyes in your lustful urge. למען תזכרו ועשיתם את כל מצוותיי, והייתם קדושים לאלוהיכם. אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אשר הוצאתי אתכם מארץ מצרים, להיות לכם לאלוהים. אני אדוני אלוהיכם, emet.
Adonai Elohechem emet. From Egypt you redeemed us, freeing us from bondage. For that your beloved sang praise, exalting you. Your dear ones offered hymns, songs, praise, blessings, and thanksgiving to you as sovereign, the living and enduring God. High and exalted, great and awesome, God ever humbles the proud, raises the lowly, frees the imprisoned, redeems the afflicted, helps the oppressed, answering our people when we cry out. Praise to God Most High, blessed is God and deserving of blessing. In great joy, Moses, Miriam, and Israel responded with song to you, all of them proclaiming. We are on 240. For the Amidah on page 242.
Adonai tzefatai tiftach, ufi yagid tehilatecha. Adonai, open up my lips, that my mouth may declare your praise. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu, ve'Elohei avotenu ve'imotenu, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, ve'Elohei Yaakov, Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Rachel, ve'Elohei Leah, Ha'el Hagadol, Hagibor ve'Hanora, El Elyon, Gomel Chasadim Tovim, ve'Konei Hakol, ve'Zocheh Chesdei Avot ve'Imahot, u'Mevii Geula livnei bneihem, למען שמו באהבה, מלך עוזר ומשיח ומגן. ברוך אתה אדוני, מגן אברהם ועזרת שרה.
אתה גיבור לעולם אדוני, מחיי מתים, אתה רב להושיע, מוריד הטל,
מחכה חיים בחסד, מחיי הכל ברחמים רבים, סומך נופלים ורופך אוהלים, ומתיר אסורים, ומקיים אמונתו לשני עפר. מי כמוך בעל גבורות ומידה מלך, מלך ממית ומחיה ומצמיח ישועה.
ונאמן אתה לחיות מתים, ברוך אתה אדוני, מחיי המתים.
אמן. נקדש את שמך בעולם, כשם שמקדישים אותו בשמי מרום, ככתוב על יד נביאך, וקרא זה ואמר, קדוש 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 אדוני צבאות, מלוך על הארץ כבודו. אדיר אדירנו אדוני אדוננו, אדיר שמך בכל הארץ, ברוך כבוד אדוני ממקומו. אחד הוא אלוהינו, הוא אבינו ומלכנו, הוא מושיענו והוא ישמיענו, ברחמיו לעיני כל חי. אני אדוני אלוהיכם, ימלוך אדוני לעולם, אלוהי ציון לדור ודור. הללויה. לדור ודור נגיד גודלך, ולנצח נצחים קדושתך נקדיש, ושבחך אלוהינו מפינו לא ימוש לעולם ועד. ברוך אתה אדוני האל הקדוש. We continue silently. We continue on page 260. Ose shalom, shalom bimromav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'imru amen. Ose shalom, shalom bimromav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'imru amen. Hu yaseh shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael, amen. Ose shalom, shalom bimromav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'imru amen. Ve'al kol Yisrael, amen.
We turn to page 362 for the opening of the ark.
Ein kamocha v'Elohim Adonai, ve'en kamasecha malchutecha malchut kol olamim, u'memshaltecha bechol dor v'dor. Adonai melech, Adonai malach, Adonai yimloch le'olam va'ed, Adonai oslam yitain, Adonai yevarech et amav v'shalom. Ki mitzion tetzeh Torah, ki mitzion tetzeh Torah, u'devar Adonai miYerushalayim. Baruch shenatan Torah, Torah, Baruch shenatan Torah, Torah, le'amo Yisrael b'kedushato. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Echad Eloheinu, Gadol Adonenu, Kadosh Shemo. Gadol Adonai iti, oneromema Shemo yachdav. La
Shabbat Shalom, you may be seated. Welcome to everybody joining us in person, Zoom, Facebook, YouTube. So you can imagine Moses in the beginning of this week's Torah portion is 120 years old. And so you can imagine Moses, we're at the very end of the book of Numbers, and he's gearing up for his retirement speech, which makes up the entirety of the book of Deuteronomy that will start next week. And Moses has had a very lengthy, very tough career. And probably, after taking the Israelites through the journey, through the 40 years, he took them out of Egypt, he took them to Mount Sinai. Finally, Moses, you can imagine, he's very much looking forward to retirement. And you can imagine the Israelites are gathered, they're on the east side of the Jordan River, and Moses is about to start giving them the summary of the Torah that will begin next week in Deuteronomy, but all of a sudden he looks out in the distance as he's preparing his retirement speech, and he sees a couple of community leaders coming towards him. And so he says, "Welcome, what can I do for you?" And it's the heads of the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and some people from the tribe of Manasseh. And they say, "Hey Moses, I know we're gearing up for this major movement across the Jordan River. We actually don't want to go with you." And all of a sudden, you imagine Moses, he's about to retire, right? Having these flashbacks to his dealing with the spies, to dealing with the complaining in the desert. Moshe thought that he was done with this, right? He thought he was going to give his nice speech, and everything was going to be perfect, and there'd be no more complaints and discussion in the rest of Jewish history, and all would be good. And all of a sudden, now Moses is having 20% of the Jewish community basically saying they don't want to go on to that next step. They want to stay encamped on the east side of the Jordan. And so we open the book, the chapter Numbers 32, and Moses is, of course, very shocked, and so he starts to probe, right? He wants to feel them out. Are these people just making trouble for the heck of it? Are they similar to Korach or similar to the spies that are ideologically opposed to what I'm doing? Or is there some other reason? And so you can imagine the conversation. Moshe says, we've sort of been preparing for this for a long time. What's wrong with going to the west side? And the leaders of the tribe say, there's nothing wrong with it. We're not opposed, but we're actually cattle ranchers. And it turns out that the land on the east side of the Jordan just happens to be better for our profession. It happens to be better for our career. And even a man like Moses sees some sense there, and Moses can tell that they're not trying to contradict his leadership. They just have a different vision and a different view for what they want to accomplish. And what ends up turning out, the way that we conclude at least the narrative portion of the Torah before the book of Deuteronomy, is we're thrown into a paradigm, into a discussion of what happens when there's a community, and we could think of community however we want, when there's an ideological divide in that community, right? This isn't an ideological divide because the other half are idiots. This isn't an ideological divide because the other half is immoral. The ranchers happen to need something different than the people that are going to cross over to the west side of the Jordan. And so Moses is faced with this last leadership crisis, but really this paradigm of what Moshe is faced with is a striking vision for all leadership in future societies. So we imagine the river, right? What's this metaphor of crossing over the river? So it turns out that in Judaism, we're very fond of water metaphors. And it turns out that rivers oftentimes in Jewish tradition encapsulate a different ideological position. And the first place we see this is with Abraham. Right? Abraham had many names, right? But nobody called Abraham an Israelite. That didn't happen until generations later when his grandson became Yisrael instead of Yaakov. Nobody called him a Jew, right? That demarker didn't happen until hundreds of years later during the Babylonian exile. They called Abraham HaIvri. And so the rabbis are puzzled, what does this mean, Ivri? And it turns out the word Aver, ayin bet resh in Hebrew, means on the other side of. And so the rabbis say, what was so special about Abraham? Well, he left his hometown, that was, again, on the east side of the Jordan, right, in Ur, and traveled over the river into the land of Israel. And so Abraham, as a one who was willing to cross rivers, was willing to challenge the ideological status quo and cross over a metaphorical river, meaning he had a different ideology than the rest of the world. And so we're faced with this paradigm, the last test of Moses' leadership. What is he going to do? when it seems like 20 to 25% of his community simply has a different ideological view of what they want their future to look like? And this is a question that isn't just limited to religious leadership. This is a question of what happens when you have a good childhood friend that you find out votes differently than you, or when your children grow up and for some reason they're not every ideological viewpoint you imagined and they take upon a different religious stance than you, and any so often. So it turns out that when Moses responds to Reuven, Gad, and half of Manasseh, he has two main concerns. His first concern is very pragmatic. He says, well, listen, we're all gearing up to cross over to the west side of the Jordan, and we're about to face a big war, right? If we remember back from the spies, the thing the spies were so afraid of was the fact that there were very powerful armies and giants in the land of Israel. And so Moses said, it would really hurt us in our military efforts if 25% of our camp decided not to come. His second fear is, you guys are going to be a bad influence on everybody. I'm trying to motivate everybody to set up this new civilization in the land of Israel, and it seems like it's going to be bad for morale for there to be a different ideological viewpoint. We want everybody in the Jewish community, you can imagine Moses saying this, to follow me ideologically and think crossing over the Jordan is the right thing to do. His first concern, obviously very pragmatic, you need to gear up for a war. Second concern is much more existential. How do you remain the leader of a community? How do you remain one people, the Israelite nation, when you have an ideological divide smack in the middle of your community? And so we keep reading Numbers 32, and the heads of the tribe give an answer. And they said, don't worry, Moses, all of your fears are unfounded. We'll help you in the war effort, and then we'll come back home. And now Jewish scholars are puzzled by this answer, because this is the only answer they give. And as scholars rightly note, well, this answer is the first question, right? If your only worry is the pragmatic, how are we going to have enough soldiers to fight in this war, that's a very great answer. Okay, I'll assuage that fear because, sure, we will cross over the river, we'll do the war, and then we'll move back over, which is exactly what they said. But there's no mention of the second question. There's no attempt to bridge the gap. There's no attempt to explain to Moses, no, don't worry, we're actually going to be ideologically on the same team. No, don't worry, we're actually going to be able to somehow not cause a break in morale because we want to stay on the east side. And I want to propose that this question that Moses is asked in his last day, really, of leadership, this is the existential question that has faced not just the Jewish community, but societies writ large for 3,500 years since this day on the Jordan. Right? How do you remain one people, humankind, a society, a country, a Jewish community, when you have these ideological divides? Because unlike, again, the 40 years in the desert, this isn't some naive, stupid, immature, whatever epithet we want to give. This isn't that type of challenge. This is a real challenge. There's a real need based off these people's livelihood and their views to live on the east side, and there's a real need for other people to live on the west side of this ideological divide. So one of my all-time favorite stories in the Talmud, I tell this whenever I have the chance to tell it, involves a rabbinic chavruta, a study pair duo named Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. These were Babylonian sages, probably sometime 4th and 5th century CE, and these two study partners are on virtually every single page of the Talmud. It's impossible to read any Talmudic debate without Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish going at it, arguing back and forth. And one time they happened to be arguing about a very minute point of Jewish law. They're arguing about what stage of a weapon can it become susceptible to impurity, right? Hardly the thing that creates ideological and communal schisms, but they're going back and forth, and they're each trying to provide their rationale and why the other one's wrong, right? A very civil debate. And all of a sudden, Rabbi Yochanan seems like he's losing the debate. And so he remembers that his study partner, Reish Lakish, well, he actually didn't have such a good upbringing. It turns out that Reish Lakish was involved in a bandit group. He was involved in a gang in his teenage years before he began to come to the Beit Midrash, the study hall, and become a famous rabbi. And so when Rabbi Yochanan sees that he's losing the debate, he tells Reish Lakish, you would know, a robber knows his craft, right? We're talking about weapons, you would know. And this ad hominem in classic Talmudic hyperbole causes Reish Lakish to be so depressed that the Talmud says that he dies. Probably a metaphor for discontinuing all conversation with Rabbi Yochanan. And so all of a sudden, Rabbi Yochanan, you're this man who's been debating and talking for 20, 30 years with your study partner. You can imagine every single day they're showing up to work, to the Beit Midrash, and having this ideological back and forth. And all of a sudden, his study partner isn't there. So he falls into a deep depression. And it's been days, and he just hasn't gotten out of his room. He hasn't been showing up to the study hall. And the other rabbis are, unsurprisingly, they are trying to figure out how to fix the scenario. And they're saying, well, Yochanan is extremely depressed, right? We need to find somebody else of his intellect that can match his views. And so they search, and you can imagine, they go throughout all of the different schools, all of the different B'tei Midrashot, right? This is in Babylonia, and they're looking for who can be a scholar that can match Rabbi Yochanan in order to get him out of this funk. And they find a man, the Talmud says, named Rabbi Eliezer. And Rabbi Eliezer was a very special man, in which every time somebody said an ideological view, Rabbi Eliezer had such an encyclopedic knowledge of Jewish tradition, he was able to provide 40 reasons why that person was correct. So you would say, I think that for high holidays we should do this prayer, and he would immediately give you 40 different reasons from Jewish tradition why you were right. And so they said, okay, this guy's going to be perfect for Rabbi Yochanan. And so they tell Rabbi Yochanan, I know your friend, your chavruta, Reish Lakish, is no longer here, but we have this new guy, Rabbi Eliezer. Try to study with him. And so you imagine, first day, Rabbi Yochanan begins to give his view. And unlike Reish Lakish, who says, no, I think you're wrong, here's why, Rabbi Eliezer says, you're right. Here are 20 reasons you didn't even think of why you're right. And Rabbi Yochanan's maybe, oh yeah, I am right. This is great. Day 2, same thing. This other opinion. I think this pastry is kosher. You're right. Here are 25 other reasons why you're right. And slowly, what maybe is initially a incredible, right, scenario turns to quickly be a very depressive scenario. And Yochanan's sitting there thinking, I know that I'm right. I don't need this guy who's sitting across from me to tell me that all of my worldviews are correct. If I didn't think they were correct, I wouldn't say them, right? I don't show up to the study hall. I'm not coming to the Beit Midrash to confirm everything I ever believe. I want to engage in a conversation. And so after one of these such study bouts, Yochanan looks up and he says, Eliezer, when I used to study with Reish Lakish, he would tell me 40 reasons why I was incorrect. And I would have to come up with 40 other reasons why I was correct. And everybody listening, everybody following this debate would be that much wiser because they would hear two people with different ideological viewpoints going at it. And all you tell me is, you're right, you're right. And in another bout of classic Talmudic hyperbole, the story ends with Yochanan sitting there on the floor of the Beit Midrash saying, O Lakisha, right, an endearing name for his friend Reish Lakish, where are you, O Lakisha? And then Yochanan peters out of the story. Living in a world, in a society, in a family, in a Jewish community, where there's a river in the middle of the community, when there's an ideological divide, is tough. But a world in which we're forced into one side of a river, a world in which there isn't that other side of the river, to balance viewpoints, to add to the ideological diversity, to force in us to sharpen our views, whatever those views may be, political, religious, social views, that world is much, much worse. And in the end of the story, right, flashback to the desert, after Reuven, Gad, and the tribe of Manasseh come to Moses and say, don't worry, we're going to help you fight, even though they don't provide a solution for the fact that they are going to be ideological divergent, Moses has a meeting with God, and they agree. And they say, yes, we want to cultivate a tradition where we allow two sides of the river, right? Come together, make sure to come together for pragmatic times where we need each other, right? When we're going to war, when there's a threat to the community, yes, we need to band together. And then we have to rise above our differences. But what Moshe is saying, and the last great act of leadership that Moshe lays out for the community, which I think has been a mainstay of the Jewish tradition for the past 4,000 years is the fact that we allow, we foment, and we foster multiple, and a multiplicity of points of view in our community, yet we remain one people. Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you, Aiden. The final two parshas that we'll be reading this week begin on page 1215 of the Blue Book, the third line. Yam tu, bracha bat tzvi hakohen imenucha, Barbara Levine, and reading will be Mark Filowitz.
Baruch Adonai mevarach le'olam va'ed.
Baruch Adonai habarach le'olam va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher b'charbanu mikol ami v'natan lanu et torto. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen.
Aber Moshe el Rashi Hamatot Livnei Yisrael Le'emor Zeh HaDavar Asher Tziva Adonai Ish Ki Yador Nader L'Adonai Ohi Shabbat Shavua Lasar Lasor Izar Al Nifsho Lo Yached Davaro Ki Chal Hayatse Mipi Yaseh Veish Ki Tidor Neder Ladonai V'Yasra Isa B'nei Avicha B'niurata.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torah emet v'chayei olam natan v'tetoteinu. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen.
Amen. Yamod ve'yamod Malka bat Jorge, Milat Surlin, and reading will be Nitza Hennig. We're continuing on page 1215, second column.
Baruch et Adonai hamevarach.
Baruch Adonai mevarach le'olam va'ed.
Baruch Adonai hamevarach le'olam va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher b'charbanu mikol hamim v'natan lanu et torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen.
ושמע אביה את נדרה ושרה אשר אסרה על נפשה והחריש לה אביה וקמו כל נדריה וכל איסר אשר אסרה על נפשה מיקום ואם הניע אביה אותם ביום שמעו כל נדריה ואסריה אשר אסרה על נפשה לא יקום ואדוני יסלח לה כי הניע ביה אותה ואם היו תהיה לאיש ונדריה עליה או מבטא שפתיה אשר אסרה על נפשה. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם אשר נתן לנו תורת אמת וחיי עולם נטע בתוכנו. Baruch atah Adonai, noten haTorah.
Amen.
Yamod v'yamod Ari ben Yosef, the birthday boy, and our fine pianist, Evan Griffith. And reading will be Rabbi Daniel Levine.
Baruch et Adonai Amvarach. Baruch Adonai Amvarach leolam vaed. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen.
Amen. V'shema isha b'yom shamo v'achrish la v'kamon edereha v'esara sh'Yisrael nafsha yakumu v'im ein b'yom shema isha yani ota v'efer et nedereha asher aleha v'et mivta sifatiyaha asher asura al nafsha Adonai salach laha v'neder amana v'grisha kol asher Yisrael al nafsha yakum aleha v'im beit isha nedra o Yisra Yisrael al nafsha b'shavua.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torah temet v'chayei olam nata b'toheinu. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen. The Mafter is found on page 1248. Yamod v'yamod Yuval ben Baruch. Our other birthday boy, Yuval Sorkin, and our fine saxophonist. And reading will be cantorial fellow Gabriel Newman.
ברכו את אדוני מבורך. ברוך אדוני מבורך לעולם ועד. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם אשר בחר בנו מכל העמים ונתן לנו את תורתו. ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה.
Amen. Vatiyana machlat yitza v'chagla umilka v'noa banot tzalafchot livnei dodihen lenashim b'mishpachot b'nei Menashe ben Yosef hayu lenashim Vatehi Nachalatan Mate Mishpachot Avihen Ela Hamitzvot V'Hamishpatim Asher Tziva Adonai B'Yad Moshe B'nei Yisrael Be'arvot Moav Yarden Yerecho חזק, חזק ונתחזק.
ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם אשר נתן לנו תורת אמת וחיי עולם נטע בתוכנו. ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה.
Amen.
We turn to page 370 for the Mishu Berach for everybody who helped out and participated in the Torah service. Misha Berach Avotenu v'Imotenu Avraham Yitzchak Yaakov Sarah Rivka Rachel Leah Hu Yivarech et Kol Ha'olim Ba'avor She'alu L'chvod HaMakom U'Lichvod HaTorah B'chazeh HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yishmerehu V'Yatzilenu Mikol Tzara U'Tzuka U'Mikol Naga U'Machla V'Yishlach Bracha V'Atzlacha B'chol Masei Yadehem Im Kol Yisrael V'Na'mahar Amen. Before we recite the Mishu Berach for refuah, for healing, we keep in mind the Shabbat, anyone in our community, anybody who we might know in need of refuah this Shabbat, be it a physical refuah, a physical healing, a spiritual healing, any type of addiction or mental illness. Misha Berach Avotenu v'Imotenu Avraham Yitzchak Yaakov Sarah Rivka Rachel Leah Hu Yivarech et Kol HaCholim HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yimalei Rachamim Aleihem Lahachmilam Ulerefuatam Ulahachzikam V'Yishlach Mehem Mehera Refuah Refuah Shalema Min HaShamayim Refuah HaNefesh Refuah HaGuf Hashta Bagalau Zakari Viramahar. Amen. Please rise for the lifting of the Torah.
וזאת התורה אשר שם משה לפני בני ישראל על פי אדוני ביד משה. על שלושה דברים, על שלושה דברים, על שלושה דברים העולם עומד. על שלושה דברים, על שלושה דברים, על שלושה דברים העולם עומד. על התורה ועל העבודה ועל גמילות חסדים. על התורה ועל העבודה ועל גמילות חסדים. על שלושה דברים, על שלושה דברים, על שלושה דברים העולם עומד. על התורה ועל העבודה ועל גמילות חסדים. על התורה ועל העבודה ועל גמילות חסדים. We return the Torah to the Ark. We are on page 374. עץ חיים היא למחזיקים בה ותומיה מראשה דרכיה דרכי נועם וכל נתיבותיה שלום. השיבנו אדוני אליך ונשובה חדש ימינו כקדם. We continue on Aleinu, page 586. עלינו לשבח לאדון הכל, לתת גדולה ליוצר בראשית, שלא עשנו כגויי הארצות, ולא שמנו כמשפחות האדמה, שלא שם חלקנו כהם, וגורלנו ככל המונם. ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים הקדוש ברוך הוא. ונאמר והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ ביום ההוא, ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד ושמו
We now turn our thoughts to those whose time on earth has ended, those in recent days and those longer. There is somebody who you would like to mention. I invite you, if you are on one of our social platforms, to put their names in the chat box. If you are here in our sanctuary, if you are in the Shiva period, I invite you to rise and share your loved one's name with us. If you are in the first year of mourning, I invite
30
you
days.
to rise.
30
days, excuse me. 30 days, I invite you to rise. If you are in the first year of mourning, I invite you to share your name with us. Rita Silverstein, Art Levine, Varda Hennig,
And I'm remembering Jonathan Kazin.
Jonathan Kaysen. If you are observing a yort site, I invite you to rise and share your loved one's name with us. In addition to those mentioned, we also remember Jennifer Marks, Fred Lair, Ruth Hirsch, Ann Shankman, Ada Barnhard, Sylvia Fritz, Jerry Amsterdam, Barbara Subeck, Lena Cohen, Morris Cohen, Harry Goldman, Howard Miller, Minnie Reisig, Suzanne Edelman, Dror Greenfield, Howard Shapsis, George Goldman, and Paul Friedman. Are there those in the chat box for us to mention?
Jonathan Kaysen and Randy Sostock.
Thank you. For those mentioned and for those we hold in our hearts, if it is your custom to rise to join our mourners, I invite you to do so as we join them on page 598 for Kaddish Yatom.
Yitgadal v'yitkadash Shemei Rabbah, Be'alma divarach hirutei v'yamlich malchutei, B'chayechon uvyomechon, Uv'chaye dechol Beit Yisrael, Ba'agala uv'zman kariv v'imru Amen. Yehi Shemei Rabbah mevarach le'olam olamei almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh. V'yithadar v'yit'aleh v'yithalal shemei dekudesha b'richu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata. Tushbechata v'nechemata. Da'amiran be'alma v'imru Amen. Yehi shlama rabba min shemaya. V'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru Amen. Oseh shalom b'imromav, hu ya'aseh shalom, aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael, v'imru Amen.
May the one who sends peace send peace to all who mourn and comfort to all who are bereaved. And we say, Amen.
Just a couple announcements this Shabbat. First of all, thank you everybody for joining us, those in person, Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube. Next Friday night, August 5th, we will be having a meet and greet with Rabbi Marsha Tilchin, followed by a post-services oneg.
So next Friday is an in-person service.
An in-person service. Would be hard to eat an oneg over Zoom. And Zoom. We will also be having Zoom, but come join us in person next Friday night to meet in person Rabbi Marsha Tilchin with also in-person food. On Friday,
If you're on Zoom, bring your own.
Yes, if you're in, you could still eat if you're on Zoom. The Friday night after that, we will be having Men's Club Shabbat, also an in-person Friday with also an oneg to follow. We have other events later on, but we will keep track of those as August unfolds. And one other important date is that a week from tomorrow, next Sunday, is Tisha B'Av, the Jewish communal day of mourning. We're going to be having programming on Sunday, but the timing is not finalized yet, so make sure to check your TBT tidbits for all the information. And we conclude services with Adon Olam on page 625.
Adon Olam Hashem Malach, B'terem kol yitzir nivra, Le'nasa v'chetzo kol, Azai melech shemo nikra, Ve'acharei kichot hakol, Levado yimnoch nora, V'hu hayav, v'hu over, V'hu yeh b'tifara, V'hu echad, ve'en sheni, Lehamshilo lehachbira, Beli reshit, beli tachlit, V'lo ha'oz, v'am yisra, V'hu eli, v'chai goli, V'tzochev li, be'et tzara, V'hu nisi, umanos li, Menat kosi, B'yom ekra, B'yado afkid ruchi, Be'et ishan, be'ayira, V'im ruchi geviati, Adonai li, V'lo hira. Shabbat shalom, everyone. Yeah. Yalai lalai, 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 yalai lalai. Laila